The wind howled through the dense forest, stirring the brittle branches of the trees into a frantic dance. Emily Dawson's phone buzzed weakly in her pocket, the screen flickering as she retrieved it. No signal, of course. She wasn't surprised this deep in the wilderness. Her GPS had already failed, leaving her without a digital crutch. She was utterly alone. The camping trip had started as a weekend escape. Emily had needed time away from the bustle of city life, away from the suffocating cubicles of her marketing job. Her best friend Claire had canceled last minute, leaving Emily to venture out alone. But she was determined 3 days of solitude under the stars sounded perfect. What could go wrong? She glanced up, squinting at the fading light. Dusk settled in, casting long shadows between the trees, and a sense of urgency fluttered in her chest. She needed to set up camp soon. As Emily trudged deeper into the forest, she spotted a small clearing just beyond a thicket of brambles. The space was perfect flat, wide enough for a tent, and bordered by the dark silhouettes of towering pines. A fire pit stood in the center, clearly used by previous campers. Perfect, she whispered to herself, already feeling a small sense of accomplishment. It didn't take long to set up her tent, and soon a small fire crackled before her, casting flickering light across the clearing. The sky darkened into a deep, velvet blue, and the stars began to peek through the canopy above. The silence of the forest was almost comforting. Almost. Emily couldn't shake a strange sensation that had crept up on her since she'd entered the woods earlier that day. It was subtle at first, a prickling feeling at the back of her neck, like being watched. She had dismissed it as nerves, but now, alone with only the sound of the crackling fire, it returned in full force. "Get it together, Emily," she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold. She poked at the fire with a stick, trying to calm her thoughts. But something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. No chirping insects, no distant hoots of owls, just silence. Unsettling silence. Her eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, but the shadows remained still. The unease lingered, heavy in the pit of her stomach. Then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest. At first she thought it was the wind, but no, it was too regular, too deliberate, like footsteps, crunching slowly through the underbrush. Emily's pulse quickened. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped altogether. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Straining to hear, she stood up, glancing around nervously. Nothing but trees and shadows. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it movement. A figure, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was fleeting, barely visible in the dark, but unmistakable. Someone or something was out there, watching her. "Hello," Emily called out, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" Silence answered her. The figure was gone, swallowed by the forest. Emily's mind raced. Had she imagined it? Maybe it was a trick of the light, or her overactive imagination. But that feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was stronger now. She hurried back to the tent, zipping it up tight and retreating into the flimsy safety of the fabric walls. Her small lantern illuminated the inside, casting a soft glow, but it did little to calm her nerves. Emily grabbed her phone, hoping to check the time or send a message, anything to feel connected to the outside world. No signal. The footsteps started again. This time they were louder, deliberate, pacing around the perimeter of her camp. Emily's breath hitched in her throat as she pressed her ear against the tent wall, listening intently. Whoever it was, they were close, too close. "Leave me alone," she yelled, her voice breaking. Her mind scrambled for a plan. Should she run? Hide? The nearest town was miles away, and without a signal she couldn't call for help. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. Emily's fingers shook as she gripped her flashlight. The beam was weak, barely piercing the darkness outside the tent. Slowly she unzipped the door just enough to peek out. The campfire had burned low, casting long shadows that stretched into the trees. Nothing. Whoever or whatever it was, they were gone. But something caught her eye. On the ground, just outside the fire's glow, was a small black device. It wasn't there before. Carefully, Emily stepped out of the tent and approached it, her heart hammering in her chest. It was an old walkie-talkie, worn and scratched from use, her brow furrowed in confusion. Where had it come from? She knelt down and picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The power switch was already on, but the speaker was silent. Suddenly, a burst of static crackled through the speaker, making her jump. Then, a voice faint and distorted broke through. Emily. Her blood ran cold. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. Her name. It had said her name. Emily stumbled back, dropping the walkie-talkie as fear surged through her. She didn't know who or what was on the other end, but she wasn't about to find out. She bolted for the tent, grabbing her things in a frantic rush, determined to get out of the woods and back to civilization. But as she stuffed her belongings into her backpack, the walkie-talkie crackled again, louder this time. Emily, don't leave. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was clearer now, though still distant. It was male, calm, but with an unsettling undertone. She froze, unsure of what to do. Her eyes darted around the clearing, but there was no sign of anyone, just the trees, the fire, and the oppressive darkness beyond. The voice came again, more insistent. Stay. With me. Emily's mind raced. Who was this? Was someone playing a cruel joke? Panic gripped her as she debated her options. Should she grab the walkie-talkie and confront them, or should she run? Her phone buzzed again, the screen flashing briefly before going dark. No signal, no help. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie emitted another burst of static, followed by a long, low hum. The voice was gone, replaced by an eerie, electronic sound that sent chills down her spine. Something wasn't right. The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath her feet began to vibrate. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she backed away from the tent, her eyes wide with fear. The trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening, twisting into unnatural shapes. Then, without warning, the walkie-talkie crackled to life again. But this time it wasn't a voice, it was laughter. Cold, mocking laughter that echoed through the clearing, growing louder and more distorted with each passing second. Emily's blood turned to ice. She spun around, searching for the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Enough, she whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave, now. Grabbing her backpack, she turned and ran into the woods, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each step. The laughter followed her, growing fainter as she sprinted deeper into the forest, her lungs burning from the effort. Branches whipped against her face, and the underbrush snagged at her clothes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The oppressive darkness pressed in on her from all sides, the trees looming like silent sentinels. But then, the laughter stopped. Emily slowed her pace, her breath ragged, ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence. No footsteps, no voices, just the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. She came to a stop, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The walkie-talkie was still in her hand, but it had gone silent as well. She stared at it, half expecting the voice to return, but the speaker remained dead. What the hell is going on? She muttered to herself, her mind racing. Just as she was about to continue, a faint light flickered in the distance. It was small, barely visible through the trees, but unmistakable. A cabin? A house? Emily's heart leapt with hope. Maybe there was someone out here who could help her. She moved cautiously toward the light, the forest thickening around her as she approached. The walkie-talkie crackled softly in her hand, but no voice came through. It was as though whoever or whatever had been speaking to her had vanished. As she neared the source of the light, Emily realized it wasn't a cabin or a house. It was a radio tower, tall and skeletal, its red warning lights blinking faintly in the dark. At the base of the tower was a small, weathered building, a maintenance shack, perhaps. Relief washed over her. If she could get inside, maybe there would be a landline, or at the very least shelter from whatever was out there. She hurried toward the shack, her flashlight flickering as she approached the door. It was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. With a deep breath, Emily pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was cramped, filled with old equipment and dusty shelves. A workbench sat against one wall, cluttered with tools and radio parts. In the corner, a small desk held an ancient-looking radio transmitter, its dials glowing faintly in the dim light. Emily set her backpack down and approached the radio, her hands trembling. She had no idea how to use it, but maybe it was her only chance to call for help. Just as she reached for the controls, the walkie-talkie in her pocket crackled to life again. But this time the voice wasn't distant or distorted. It was right behind her. Emily. She spun around, her heart lurching in her chest. The shack was empty. The door was still ajar, the night beyond still and silent. But the voice was unmistakable, closer than ever. "Why did you leave?" it asked, calm and deliberate. Emily's blood ran cold. She backed away, her eyes darting to the door. But as she turned to flee, the voice came again, louder, more insistent. "You can't leave, Emily. You belong here." The air grew thick with static, and the radio on the desk flickered to life, emitting the same low hum she had heard before. The lights in the shack dimmed, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if the very forest itself was closing in on her. "Stay with me," the voice whispered, so close it felt like it was in her ear. Emily's scream echoed through the night as she bolted from the shack, her heart racing, feet pounding the ground as she disappeared into the endless forest. The hum of the radio faded into the distance, replaced by the deafening silence of the woods. And somewhere, deep in the dark, the laughter began again. As the night dragged on, the radio tower stood tall, its lights blinking faintly against the night sky. The static from the transmitter crackled softly, whispering names into the cold, empty air. And Emily's name was among them,